We're very happy to have with us today Fernand de Varennes from, I have to tell you, looking at the bios in the program, I read this and I wondered how our staff figured out how to alphabetize him in Canada. They were apparently correct. But if you look at his bio, he's been in all kinds of other countries, so has wide experience. He is now the UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues. Since he's lived everywhere, and we're all minorities somewhere, he should be very well equipped to speak to us at this time. We're very pleased to have him with us. Let me turn the time over to him now. Please welcome our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Cole, distinguished guests, members of the clergy and colleagues, dear friends, mesdames et messieurs, señoras y caballeros, buenos días. It's an honor and a privilege to be among you today at the 26th Annual International Law and Religion Symposium here at Brigham Young University, but I hope you'll forgive me. I almost said I'm sorry because, you know, Canadians tend to apologize all the time, apparently, but I'm not going to apologize. But I will say that I may not be extremely energetic because I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning in Vienna, Austria, which is quite a different time zone, and I just arrived a few hours ago. So I hope you'll forgive me if I am not extremely energetic. Nevertheless, I am delighted to be here and hope to make, well, hopefully some contribution to your deliberations, and especially to be able to meet and exchange with some of you tonight and tomorrow morning. Mesdames et messieurs, let me begin with a story. A story from the Ancient Testament, more than 3,000 years ago, or so tells us the book of Judges in chapter 12. And this is one of the first recorded accounts of ethnic cleansing, of targeting individuals because they are the enemy, yes, but the enemy in part because they are different and recognizable because of these differences, expressed here perhaps through language or religion or ethnicity. And as the horrors of the Holocaust showed during the period before and during the Second World War, those who tend to be targeted as undeserving, untrustworthy, or a threat too often are religious or other minorities. And it's largely for this reason that the new International Moral Code, the Code of Conduct, which emerged as part of the United Nations system after the last Great War, clearly sets out that we all belong to the same family as humans and are thus inherently equal in dignity and rights, and that this was to be the foundation for peace, freedom, and justice. And yet, despite those noble principles which are supposed to be at the core of the global multilateral system and of many democracies, religious and other minorities are facing increasing threats in terms of the respect for their human rights, their dignity, and even there are threats to the actual international human rights architecture, which aims to protect the human rights of everyone equally. And of course, that which also acknowledges, in terms of this universal human rights system, that some of us are more vulnerable and need greater focus and attention. And let me explain what I mean by that. Religious and other minorities are almost everywhere in the world at the receiving end. I think that's a simple way of describing it. At the receiving end of hate speech, at the receiving end of statelessness, at the receiving end of discrimination, and at the receiving end of exclusion and other grievances that sometimes, actually too often, leads to frustration, anger, and violence, and even ethnic conflicts. Part of my mandate as UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues is to raise awareness as to how much just those two words actually describe the plight and vulnerability of religious and other minorities. And those two words are almost all. Now that's surprising, but I need to explain. We need to have clarity also in terms of why, I'll be explaining in a few moments, why almost all of the worst examples of violations of human rights target minorities. But to do this, we have to be clearer. And as more than 2,500 years ago, from the Analects attributed to Confucius, it highlights the need for clarity in the language we use if we want to understand how the world works and what are at the root of the increasing disrespect of religious and other minorities, including worldwide the rise in racism, xenophobia, and racial discrimination. And clarity of language means that we have to acknowledge that the violations of freedom of religion, situations of racial discrimination, and discrimination on the ground of religion, and hate speech, particularly hate speech through social and other media, do not affect all members of society equally. It's usually, quite often, and I'll use the words again, almost all, situations involving minorities where we have the most prominent, frequent violations of the fundamental rights and dignity of religious and other minorities that are at risk around the world. Calling the phenomena involved by their correct names is important if we are to better understand what is involved. And in this regard, please allow me to emphasize the patterns that need to be identified and addressed in terms of this vulnerability. Almost all, or at least the vast majority, of hate crimes and hate speech, racism and xenophobia target religious and other minorities. And this is in fact increasing in many parts of the world. Almost all, or more than 75% anyway, of the world's stateless, who are amongst the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, are individuals who belong to religious and other minorities. It's not a coincidence. Almost all, or at least the majority of today's conflicts, involve our internal conflicts. And very often, in most of these cases, you have religious or other minorities in situations of murderous clashes, often over claimed grievances of exclusion and discrimination. In almost all of these situations, religious and other minorities are also portrayed as disloyal, dangerous, unable to integrate, or dismissive in some way to national values, values which, of course, quite often are connected to those of the majority in a state. In other words, religious and other minorities face everywhere the otherization and dehumanization connected to their portrayal as outsiders. And it is sad to say that this is no longer, if it ever was, connected to any single form of political ideology or form of society. No form of government today is immune to intolerance and xenophobia, especially when hostility against religious and other minorities is amplified by fear, uncertainty, misinformation, particularly spread through social media, with many, and I would say too many, unable or uncertain, and unfortunately perhaps even unwilling to respond with humanity and decency. I'm going to elaborate in a few moments, but I want to emphasize how all of these are situations which fundamentally are rejections of justice, and especially of the inherent dignity and equal rights of religious and other minorities, and insufficiently acknowledge. We do not acknowledge, including at the United Nations, the extent that minorities are targeted, that minorities are vulnerable and that minorities are the ones that most need the protection that are supposed to be guaranteed by international human rights standards, a code of morality for the world. Many, in fact, too many, politicians blame, more and more blame religious and other minorities. They will blame migrants, they will blame refugees for not integrating quickly enough, or disrespecting the government or society in a sense, or being a threat because, and we've all heard this, because they're potentially antisocial, rapists, criminals, terrorists. It's very easy to do that. There is, and we've recognized this at the United Nations, there are quite a few initiatives that we have, but there is an urgency of countering racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and mobile phones that are not turned off. There is an urgency to address patterns of discrimination and exclusion which underpin much of this. And it's here where much more is needed, of course, to understand the underlying factors to explain the spread of these poisons of the mind that are spreading everywhere. And we have to look at protecting those that are most in the need of protection against these phenomena that we are now experiencing increasingly around the world. In many countries, laws against hate speech and even violent attacks against religious and other minorities are too often insufficiently enforced. That's a problem I've encountered in a number of countries. The law seems to be very protective against hate speech, against the incitement to violence against minorities and others, but in practice, it simply is not enforced properly. Coded language is used through social media, and it is spreading this disease of the mind that no one seems to be able to stop right now. Though under my mandate, as I said earlier, the United Nations has a number of initiatives, including under my own mandate, focusing on social media, hate speech, and minorities in 2020 through a series of regional forums around the world with different colleagues from different sections of the United Nations and other international organizations. But much more needs to be done because despite much of the research being done, despite a lot of initiatives with different international and regional organizations, we don't seem to be able to defend those that need to be defended the most. We do not seem to be able to actually even defend the international human rights architecture, which is now being challenged around the world by governments whom many of us would have thought would be at the forefront to defend international human rights. Because we are living in unsettling times. It is unsettling when more than 3/4 of the world's stateless are members of religious and other minorities. And let me give you an example to illustrate this. In Myanmar, there is a process which has started a number of decades ago, but the process in Myanmar has meant that there is one specific minority, the Rohingya, an ethnic religious minority, where about 1 million, or just over 1 million of them, are stateless. Now, stateless may seem like just another word, but it's not. Statelessness means you have no citizenship. And the absence of citizenship for many individuals means not having access to other rights, not having access to health care, to education, to employment opportunities, to social services. It really renders individuals, including the most vulnerable, Rohingya women and girls, for example, who are being raped. This escalated just last year when UN investigators described the situation in Myanmar in relation to the stateless Rohingya specifically as a continuing genocide against this minority, one of the most appalling human rights crises for our time, and with many other violations of their human rights and increased vulnerability. The Rohingya is one example, because minorities tend to be the most vulnerable and targeted in relation to statelessness and hate speech and others. And by the way, the situation of the Rohingya is being repeated. This is now part of the public record. We have had a number of communications on the situation in Assam, India, where there is also a process which we don't know yet, but the process may end up creating the conditions for up to 2, perhaps more, million people becoming stateless. If you think we have a humanitarian crisis in relation to 1 million Rohingya, imagine what's going to happen if we have another 2 million or more individuals being deemed stateless because essentially of their ethnic and religious background. These are minorities. This is not a neutral process. This is the result of certain mind frame, ideology, processes that tends to exclude or discriminate against minorities. By the way, I am an optimist by nature. That's a job requirement when you're a special rapporteur. And yet, well, around the world, when you have reliable statistics, it is clear that currently, worldwide, there is an increase of minorities being targeted for hate speech and denied the respect, if you will, of what they are and their very dignity. Here are statistics, very recent statistics from the United Kingdom, and one can see an increase not only in the reported cases of hate speech, but also hate speech that targets religious and other minorities, particularly religious and ethnic minorities. There are, across the world, a similar trend, including here in the United States, and I'm just going to use one source, where the data also suggests that the vast majority of cases of hate speech in the most recent years target religious and other minorities. And there are studies that show the same trend, not absolutely universally. In Canada this year, the number of reported cases of hate speech targeting minorities seem to have gone down a little bit. But in other parts of the world, the phenomenon is the opposite. It's clearly a situation where there's an increase of hate speech cases and an increase that affects minorities. This is not neutral. In fact, if you want to, and this is a generalization, one can say that in most countries, between 70 and 80% of hate speech cases target minorities. That's a rough figure, and don't quote me on that one. But actually, that's a ballpark figure. So studies show that the main targets of hate speech around the world are largely the same: ethnic or religious groups, immigrants, and refugees. Of course, there are others, including women and members of the LGBTI community. But what has changed in recent years is that hate speech and incitement to violence against minorities is increasing almost everywhere, often through social media, and closely connected to a rise in intolerance and even extremism. And what we have is that the dangers of demonizing particular groups are evident across the world. There have been xenophobic riots and violence against migrants and minorities flaring up in different parts of the globe, sometimes fanned by politicians who instrumentalize fear and unease in a changing world by scapegoating those who are new or simply different from the majority. And history shows us that once you begin to dehumanize minorities as lesser deserving human beings, as we saw with Nazi Germany and the Shoah, others will also be demonized and will be at the receiving end of extraordinarily negative portrayal in many countries. And given that the main victims of statelessness, of hate speech and violence in social media and in daily life almost everywhere, that those who are usually victims of racism and xenophobia are minorities who are demonized, it would seem, and I'll be very honest, it would seem unfortunate that the United Nations and many national authorities do not sufficiently identify and call the correct names of those who are particularly targeted and vulnerable. Minorities. We should not be afraid to say most of these cases involve minorities. We should focus on the root causes of hate speech, those that are almost 3/4 of those affected and vulnerable. Use their name. intolerance, hate speech, and discrimination against minorities also, well, has not become yet the new normal. But sometimes I have to admit, we're maybe not that so far away that we should not be afraid, very concerned with what lies ahead in some countries. Politics of division and the rhetoric of intolerance are mainly targeting racial, ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities, and migrants and refugees also are also quite often members of minorities also. So social and other non-traditional media has become weaponized, leading not only to calls of violence against religious and other minorities, as we've seen recently in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, the United States, and India, but we've even had recent cases of calls to genocide. We had a case, which I can report, it has become public, in Nigeria, where there was a religious ethnic minority was targeted with a call towards getting by the 23rd of October, that every single man, woman, and child belonging to this minority in one region of Nigeria should be killed by the 23rd of October if they had not left that region. There was even a song that was written and was being broadcast on radio calling towards a genocide against a minority. We are still at that level in some parts of the world. However, we have recognized at the United Nations through different initiatives that more has to be done. You may have noticed that last June, the Secretary General of the United Nations announced a strategy and plan of action to try to coordinate efforts across the UN system to identify, prevent, and confront hate speech. There's also, as some of you know, what is called the United Nations Rabat process, which tries to provide global guidelines on what to do in relation to prohibiting incitement to national, racial, or religious hatred. Because in the end, especially in relation to hate speech, minorities that are targeted are often religious minorities across the world. Jews, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Baha'is, and other minorities are more than not being targeted by hate speech through social media right now. And the vast and increasing number of cases of those who are at this receiving end are at the receiving end of some of the vilest calls of hate and violence, and even of threats of genocide, as I described earlier. This is not going to slow down or change unless the world community and individual states address this directly. There's a huge proportion of the world now communicates on social media, with perhaps a third of the world's population active just on Facebook. I find that astounding. You can see the reach of Facebook, one social media, but you can see the potential of quickly reaching millions and millions of people with not, unfortunately, often with messages of hate and intolerance, and calling even to violence. Unfortunately, it seems that individuals inclined towards racism, misogyny, or homophobia proliferate in their own enclosed social media niches, and that can reinforce their views, and in the case of some individuals, even lead them towards the path of violence in the search of publicity. And I mean, we've all known cases where this has occurred, but we haven't been able to address that yet. And it's going to continue and increase unless we develop more tools to try to address that, to stop that, or slow it down somehow. There have been reported cases, for example, in India, of lynch mobs attacking religious minorities following rumors originating through WhatsApp groups, or in Sri Lanka, vigilantism inspired by rumors spread online, again, targeting the Tamil Muslim minority. So we now live in a world where social media can galvanize democratic activists, that's true, but it's also a world where it can be a tool for hate groups seeking to organize huge audiences and reach huge audiences, which would never have been possible before. So how do we tackle that? In order to enable the United Nations and countries which are devoted to the respect of fundamental human rights for all, but especially religious and other minorities who are, once again, the most vulnerable and the most targeted, we need to find new ways to respond effectively. And this will require addressing the root causes of hate speech and other human rights violations that target particularly minorities. And this is why a focus on minorities is essential. To enable the United Nations to truly respond to the impact of hate speech on societies requires addressing precisely the main areas where hate speech occurs, the main causes of most cases of hate speech, particularly that propagated by social media, which can, within just a few days or even hours, reach hundreds of thousands and even millions of people. The disease of the mind requires effective medicine, targeted measures, especially in relation to religious and other minorities, if we are to be able to deal with what has also been described as a menace to democratic values, social stability, and peace, which spreads, unfortunately, like wildfire through social media, the internet, and conspiracy theories. I would add even more than that, this goes to the very core of the search for justice, peace, and stability, which were expressed more than 70 years ago in the preamble of the Universal Declaration. Now, this cannot be done by one state alone. It can only be achieved if we build and work together towards strengthening the global architecture which will enable us to address these global challenges. And that requires protection, strengthening the international human rights architecture, which to a large extent is aimed at ensuring the protection of those that most need protection also. We are all human beings. We're all part of the human family. We all need to be protected, particularly those who are the most vulnerable. If I have a few more minutes, I just want to point out also that in relation to violence around the world, minorities are usually involved because quite often minorities feel that they have grievances of injustice, exclusion, or discrimination. The first ever joint report by the World Bank and the United Nations was published just a few years ago. It was called Pathways for Peace, Inclusive Approaches to Preventing Violent Conflict. And what it pointed out is that in the last 30 years, most conflicts are internal, are within a state, within a country, not between two countries. And this is important because it also indicates that whereas violent conflicts have increased after decades of relative decline, the number of conflicts, remember these are internal, the actual also displaced populations, military spending, and terrorist incidents have all exploded in the last 20 years. The refugee problem that we have, refugee problems don't simply appear. They are underlying causes, and many of those are conflict-driven. Internal conflicts where the main drivers of instability are group-based grievances around exclusion and discrimination. Many of the world's conflicts, and in fact, one could say, beyond the instrumentalization of certain conflicts and for geopolitical reasons, quite often you have a minority, an ethnic group, that feels aggrieved. The Malay minority in the south of Thailand, the Houthi minority in Yemen, and many other conflicts are internal, and many of these involve situations where we could say there is discrimination against a minority, which causes the instability that leads to our refugee problems around the world. It's all interrelated, but it's also all connected quite often to fundamental principles of human rights and respect for the inherent dignity of all of us, which is not practiced in some states. I will use another example, which not many people have noted perhaps, but in relation to the situation in Cameroon. There's an English-speaking minority in Cameroon, and there's a conflict which has started there, and now there's a few thousand people have been killed. without expressing myself on the validity of their grievances are based on exclusion and discrimination, or so they claim. And so the way to try to address that fundamentally would seem to say, well, respect of their human right, the right to equality without discrimination. Discrimination is key. And whenever you have a group which claims that they are excluded, exclusion is also probably a symptom of discrimination, of violation of one of the most fundamental human rights in international law. So situations such as those and others that I've described will come again, will continue until we build stronger institutions, stronger mechanisms for human rights protection and implementation, and an even better understanding of the root causes of the grievances, tensions, exclusion, and discrimination, which are also inherently rejections of dignity and equal rights of religious and other minorities. And in conclusion, because apparently you have also a human right for food, I'm told. In conclusion, more than ever since the Second World War, we need a renewed commitment towards the multilateral system for protecting the most vulnerable, and this must be based on recognizing the inherent dignity and respecting the equality of rights of all members of the human family, which is founded as they are on international human rights and the values of freedom, justice, and peace. And I hope that we'll be able to reflect and debate these matters during this conference, and also perhaps to engage, and I'll have perhaps, there might be an opportunity for some of you to participate in the series of regional forums across the world, which my own mandate will be organizing next year, on the issue, on the dangers, on how we should address the dangers posed by hate speech, targeting religious and other minorities in social media. Mesdames, Messieurs, Señoras y Caballeros, Damen y Gaspeda, meine Damen und Herren. That's the best I can do, really. Merci. Thank you.
I would love to allow some questions, but I'm also conscious that he's already alluded to the right to food, which is coming soon. So perhaps we should allow, the plan is that we'll have a reception starting at the Civic Center, which is just a block west of the hotel, at 6. The dinner will actually start at 6:30. But maybe what we should do is allow people to come up and talk a little bit now, and as people start moving to the hotel. But thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Special Rapporteur.
Thank you.